Have you ever wondered what separates people who never break under pressure from everyone else? The ones who stay calm when chaos surrounds them, who act without hesitation, who never second-guess themselves? Most assume it's luck, genetics, or a rare personality, but it's not. That kind of strength comes from discipline, and from cutting away everything that weakens you. 400 years ago, one man built this kind of inner force from nothing. His name was Miyamoto Musashi, a swordsman who fought through Japan's warring states era, undefeated in dozens of duels, respected not just for his skill, but for the way he carried himself. Calm, sharp, unmoved by pressure. Later in life, he wrote the Book of Five Rings, a guide not only for combat, but for how to move through the world with clarity. It's not a poetic book, it's a manual, direct and practical. And today you'll see how the principles in that book reshaped the life of one modern doctor who lost his confidence after a single moment he couldn't take back. Because Musashi's method wasn't about adding more strength, it was about cutting away the parts of yourself that make you weak. That's the thread that runs through everything you're about to hear. But before we move to the ultimate principle that will definitely reshape your reality, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more content like this. Stick around with the people who are actually growing. Now, let's begin. When people read the Book of Five Rings, they picture duels, samurai, techniques, maybe a few quotes they've seen online. But the real value in Musashi's work shows up in the moments when life corners you, when your mind fractures under pressure, when you no longer trust yourself. That's where his principles actually matter. And that's exactly where our story starts. Not with a warrior, not with a fighter, but with a physician who built his entire identity on staying calm when everyone else panics. His name is Dr. Adrian Hale, and for most of his career he thought he understood what pressure was. Long shifts, crowded emergency rooms, non-stop decisions. That was his world, and for years it seemed like nothing could shake him. Until one night did. It wasn't some dramatic disaster. It wasn't a chaotic trauma scene. It wasn't even the kind of case that usually keeps doctors awake after their shift. It was a routine emergency that should have gone the way 100 others had before. But in high-stakes work, the danger isn't always in the complexity. It's in the tiny cracks where doubt slips in. A patient came in complaining of chest pain. Late 30s, sweating, breathing fast. Every symptom pointed in two possible directions, and both required opposite responses. Adrian had seen it so many times that he could almost hear the checklist in his head before the nurses finished reporting. And yet, for the first time in his career, something didn't line up in his mind. A small detail bothered him, a subtle inconsistency he couldn't name. Instead of trusting what he knew, he hesitated. Just long enough for the wrong diagnosis to become the priority, long enough for irreversible damage to take hold. The patient didn't make it. The team ran the review. The chief explained the layers of complexity. Colleagues reassured him that the outcome wasn't his fault. But none of that mattered, because the moment he replayed wasn't the test result or the medical detail. It was the hesitation. That pause froze him more than the outcome itself, and from that point on, something in him collapsed. Confidence is quiet when you have it, but the absence of it becomes loud. Adrian began doubting decisions he used to make instantly. He avoided taking charge. He felt slow, clumsy, off balance. His hands were steady, but his mind wasn't. And in medicine, the mind is everything. He didn't tell anyone at home. He didn't want comfort. He didn't want excuses. He wanted to understand what broke inside him, and more importantly, why he couldn't pull himself back together. One night, after another shift where he felt like a stranger in his own body, his department chief stopped him. He didn't criticize him. He didn't sugarcoat anything either. He just gave him a short, direct judgment. Your medical knowledge is intact, but your mind isn't moving the way it used to. That single sentence hit harder than the case review, harder than the failure itself, because it was true. Something in his internal foundation had cracked, and logic wasn't fixing it. That was the moment Adrian realized he needed a different kind of solution. Not more information, not more training, not more reassurances. Something deeper. Something older. Something that dealt with fear, clarity, presence, and the way a person sees themselves under pressure. That search led him straight to a book he hadn't touched since college. A book written by a man who understood fear better than any modern psychologist. A swordsman who mastered clarity in the face of death. Miyamoto Musashi.
This is where Adrian's transformation begins. Dr. Adrian didn't open Musashi's book looking for philosophy. He opened it because he needed a language for something he couldn't explain, that invisible fracture inside him. The book felt strange in his hands, old, worn. The pages had that slight dryness that suggests they've been read by people searching for something deeper than information. He flipped to a random chapter, not expecting much, but Musashi's writing wasn't poetic or gentle. It was blunt, cold, almost confrontational. The first line he read said, "Fixation is the enemy of mastery." It didn't feel like advice. It felt like an accusation, because that was exactly what he'd been doing. Fixating on the moment he hesitated, rehearsing it in his mind every night, turning it into a prison cell he couldn't walk out of. Musashi wasn't talking about sword technique. He was talking about the mind's tendency to freeze when you grip a single thought too tightly. For the first time in weeks, Adrian exhaled, not because he suddenly understood everything, but because he could finally name the enemy. Fixation, hesitation, the clutter that fogs the mind under pressure. He closed the book and thought he understood it. He didn't. Not yet. Over the next few days, something unexpected happened. He kept thinking about that line, kept feeling the weight of it. The more he sat with it, the more he realized that Musashi wasn't describing a mistake. He was describing a pattern, one that had quietly built itself inside Adrian long before that patient ever walked into his ER. A pattern of overthinking, a pattern of second-guessing, a pattern of believing clarity was something you felt, not something you practiced. That realization bothered him, because if the problem wasn't the case, and wasn't the complexity, and wasn't bad luck, then the failure was rooted in him, and that meant the solution would have to be rooted in him too. A few nights later, after a long shift, he sat alone in his small office at the hospital. He turned to another chapter, the Book of Earth. Musashi wrote about foundations, stability, the unglamorous work of clearing away mental noise. One line struck him harder than any medical textbook ever had. The way is in training. Not reading, not reflecting, not regretting, training. Musashi was pointing at something simple but brutal. Clarity is not a feeling. It is a discipline. You don't rise to the moment. You fall to the level of your training. And in that instant, Adrian recognized a truth he'd been avoiding. He trained his knowledge, he trained his hands, but he never trained his mind. Not really. Not the way Musashi meant it. That night, he made a decision. A quiet one. A private one. He would rebuild his mind the way a swordsman rebuilds their stance, from the ground up. No theory, no self-pity, no shortcuts. He didn't know it yet, but that decision would pull him into the first Musashi principle that would change everything.
Chapter 1. K. The Awakening.
There's a moment in every transformation where reality stops being optional, where the excuses fall silent, where the image you built of yourself gets peeled away piece by piece until you're forced to look directly at the truth. For Adrian, that moment arrived at 3:17 a.m. The emergency room was quiet that night, unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that gives you too much space to think. He was reviewing charts, half tired, half restless, when he reached the record of the patient he lost. The digital file sat there, cold and factual, like a mirror reflecting everything he didn't want to confront. He hovered over the page for a long time. His finger didn't move. His breathing didn't change. But inside, something cracked. And that's when Musashi's words returned. Understand the smallest thing and the largest thing, the shallowest thing and the deepest thing. Most people read that as philosophy. Adrian read it as a challenge. Because the smallest thing that night, his hesitation, had become the largest thing in his entire life. A single moment had expanded, casting shadows across everything he used to do effortlessly. He realized Musashi wasn't talking about knowledge. He was talking about awareness, the ability to see yourself without distortion. And Adrian had been avoiding that. He closed the chart, not because he couldn't bear to look at it, but because he finally understood that the point wasn't the patient, the case, or the diagnosis. The point was the mechanism inside him that allowed hesitation to take control. Suddenly, the room felt too small. He stood up, walked to the break room, and sat down. For the first time since the incident, he allowed himself to relive the moment, not emotionally, not defensively, but analytically, like a swordsman studying the opening that cost him a duel. He replayed the patient describing his symptoms, replayed the nurses reporting their findings, replayed his own physical posture, his own breathing, the way his eyes had darted between the monitors and the patient. He saw something he hadn't seen before. He wasn't overwhelmed by the situation. He was overwhelmed by himself, by noise, by doubt, by the internal chatter that Musashi warned against. Musashi called this phenomenon mikiru, the halted eye, the moment your inner world becomes louder than the outer one. And that was Adrian's awakening. Not a dramatic revelation, not a breakdown, not a burst of motivation, just clarity. Cold. Quiet. Undeniable. He whispered into the empty room, almost involuntarily, "It wasn't the case. It was me." Not in a self-punishing way, but in a precise way, the way Musashi meant, the way a warrior studies his own opening, not to suffer, but to sharpen. He realized the truth. He had trained to treat disease. He had trained to manage crises. But he had never trained to manage his mind. And in Musashi's worldview, that made him unarmed. The awakening wasn't about guilt. It was about responsibility. The responsibility to build a mind that does not collapse under pressure, the responsibility to eliminate the mental weaknesses that leave openings, the responsibility to stop believing that clarity is something you feel and start treating it as a practice. For the first time in months, Adrian felt something shift inside him. Not confidence, that was still far away. What he felt was resolve. A clean, simple resolve. He would not allow hesitation to rule him again. He opened Musashi's book, placed it on the table, and wrote a single note in the margin. If the enemy is inside, the training must begin there. That note became the beginning of his discipline, the beginning of his rebuilding, the beginning of his path back to himself. From that point on, he stopped searching for comfort. He started searching for elimination, the next Musashi principle. A principle far more brutal than awakening. A principle that demands you cut away parts of yourself. And Adrian was about to learn exactly how far that would go. Chapter 2. The Principle of Elimination. Adrian didn't drift into this principle gently. He slammed into it with the force of someone who had run out of places to hide. Because when Musashi spoke about cutting away what weakens you, he wasn't talking about productivity hacks or tightening up your daily routines. He was talking about something far more violent. The removal of everything inside you that clings to comfort, hesitation, and self-preservation. And Adrian learned this the hard way, because the very first thing he had to eliminate wasn't a bad habit or a wasted hour. It was the version of himself he still pretended to be. The competent doctor, the calm decision-maker, the man who never broke under pressure. That identity was a shell, but he had worn it so long that he mistook it for skin. Musashi warned about this in a line Adrian would underline 3 times. Beware the familiar self. It is the most deceptive enemy. And that sentence hit him harder than the pages about sword fighting, harder than the lessons on strategy, because deep down he knew that the part of him that froze that night that patient died wasn't an accident. It was a symptom. The patient didn't die because he lacked skill. Adrian knew the protocol. He knew the sequence. He had done it 100 times. The patient died because in that split second, Adrian hesitated. And when a doctor hesitates, someone else pays the price.
That memory wasn't something he could motivate himself past. He tried for weeks to bury it under work, under noise, under constant motion inside the hospital. But in the one environment he couldn't escape, his own mind, he kept replaying the moment the heartbeat slipped away. That was the moment he realized elimination wasn't optional. It was survival. So he started small. Not with grand gestures, but with the simplest battlefield he could control, his morning. He stripped it bare. No noise, no phone, no comforting distractions to soften the edges of his thoughts. Just silence, thick enough to make his pulse loud. And in that silence, he finally heard the enemy Musashi had warned him about. The internal voice that whispers the easiest version of your life into your ear. The voice that says, you can start later. Don't push too hard today. You deserve to rest. It didn't sound malicious. It sounded reasonable, gentle, almost protective. But it was the same voice that had told him he had a little more time that night in the emergency room. The same voice that cost a man's life. So Adrian began the elimination, not by arguing with the voice, but by refusing to obey it. Every morning, when it negotiated for comfort, he ignored it. Every time it offered him a softer path, he stepped toward the harder one. At first, the resistance was subtle, a tightening in his throat, a heaviness in his limbs. But as he pushed deeper, the resistance sharpened. He felt anxious, irritable, restless. His mind tried everything to pull him back to familiar patterns, patterns that kept him predictable but weak. And yet, day after day, he cut more away. The unnecessary conversations, the digital noise, the hours he spent numbing himself with meaningless content, even certain colleagues whose presence made his thoughts foggy and unfocused. This wasn't about becoming productive, it was about becoming clear. And as his life became quieter, he began to notice a strange sensation building inside him. Space. A space he hadn't felt in years. Space to think, to breathe, to confront the truth without flinching. But that space didn't feel peaceful. It felt dangerous. Because in that silence, he could no longer escape the deeper eliminations he had avoided. His environment, his habits, his patterns of self-betrayal, the routines he had built to look strong instead of be strong. Musashi's path was uncompromising. It demanded that every weakness be exposed, examined, and cut away. Not just the easy ones, but the ones woven into his identity. Adrian wasn't ready for that level of honesty. He could feel the next test approaching like a storm on the edge of a horizon, slow, heavy, inevitable. A moment that would force him to confront the cost of his hesitation, not as a theoretical weakness, but as a living part of his life. And when that test arrived, it wouldn't ask him politely. It would break him open. And Adrian had no idea that moment was coming sooner than he thought. Chapter 3. HEIJŌ-SHIN, the Everyday Mind. The test arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, one of those quiet hospital days that feel borrowed, like the building itself is holding its breath.
Adrian was reviewing charts, sipping cold coffee, doing everything with the detached focus that routine work cultivates. Nothing hinted that the next few minutes would become the real measure of whether all his elimination work meant anything. Then the door snapped open, and a nurse stepped in with a look that cut through the room. Urgency sharpened by fear, but wrapped in the control only experienced nurses possess. "Adrian, you're needed in room 14. Now." That was all she said. No details, no explanation. But something in her voice, the clipped edges of it, told him exactly what kind of moment waited down the hallway. As he followed her, his pulse didn't race, but the old fear, the quiet, insidious one, stirred like a shadow returning to familiar ground. It whispered the same questions it whispered on the worst night of his career. What if you freeze again? What if nothing is changed? What if you fail twice? For a moment, the memory of the collapsing vitals, the alarms blaring, the breath that never returned, it all pressed at the edges of his mind. But then another voice rose, like steel cutting through fog, Musashi's reminder that the warrior's mind must remain ordinary, unmoved, level, steady in all things. HEIJŌ-SHIN, the everyday mind. The mind that does not rise in panic, nor sink in comfort. The mind that stays flat, clear, constant. Adrian inhaled once, slowly, quietly, deliberately, and walked into room 14. Chaos hit him immediately. A middle-aged man was ripping shallow, frantic breaths through a partially dislodged oxygen mask. The monitor screamed warnings. A young resident hovered near the bed, his eyes wide and unfocused, his hands trembling in that barely perceptible way that gives panic away. A nurse was fumbling with the tubing, another was shouting for respiratory support. The air felt tight with urgency. A few months ago, this exact scene would have broken him. He would have frozen, not visibly, not enough for anyone to call it out, but internally, where it mattered. His thoughts would have tangled, his instincts would have stalled, his mind would have fractured into hesitation. That hesitation had already cost a life once. But now, it didn't. Because the elimination created space inside him. And in that space, something new, something Musashi had pointed toward, finally had room to take shape. His mind didn't splinter. His chest didn't tighten. Nothing inside him surged or collapsed. Instead, everything became quiet, focused, clear to the point of stillness. He didn't feel brave, he felt present in a way he never had. He stepped forward, not rushed, not tense, but with the controlled precision of someone who had stripped away every internal obstacle. He said, "Secure the airway. Bring me a fresh mask, oxygen at 15 liters, page respiratory, and bring the crash cart." The transformation in the room was immediate. His tone wasn't loud, wasn't commanding in a theatrical sense, it was simply anchored. And that anchoring cut through everyone's panic. They moved with purpose now, not frenzy. In seconds, the mask was replaced, airflow corrected, tubing secured, vitals monitored with clear eyes instead of frantic ones. Within a minute, the violent gasping softened into strained but stable breaths. The heart rate leveled. The alarms quieted. He didn't celebrate. He didn't sigh with relief. He didn't even look around to see who noticed. The middle-aged man was staring at him like he had performed some impossible act, but Adrian wasn't focused on that either. He was focused on the simple, startling truth settling into him like a new kind of gravity. There was no fear. No hesitation. No internal tremor. He realized this wasn't courage, it was absence. The absence of noise. The absence of self-doubt. The absence of the runaway mind that once hijacked his actions. This was HEIJŌ-SHIN, the everyday mind. The mind that doesn't change in a crisis because it doesn't change when things are easy. And in that moment, standing in the stillness that follows chaos, Adrian understood something that struck deeper than the patient he'd just saved. This wasn't the end of his transformation. It was the first hint of what could come next, if he kept going.
Chapter 4. Forging the Body. The aftermath of the incident in room 14 followed Adrian for the rest of the day. Not in the way trauma lingers, but in the way a new truth refuses to leave you alone. Every time he replayed the scene in his mind, the panic, the rush, the noise, the potential for disaster, he kept returning to one detail that felt almost unreal. He hadn't been shaken. Not in slightly. His breath had stayed even. His thoughts had stayed sharp. His hands had moved without the tremor he had grown accustomed to hiding. For the first time in a long time, he had acted like the doctor he used to believe he could be. But Musashi's principles didn't allow for comfort. They didn't congratulate. They didn't let you settle. They demanded the next cut, the next discipline, the next stripping of weakness. And the next principle staring him in the face was the one he had been subconsciously avoiding: forging the body. Musashi had been mercilessly clear on this point. When the body is strong, the mind follows. Adrian had always skimmed past this line, not because he disagreed with it, because he knew exactly what it would require from him. His body was not weak in the conventional sense. He was a doctor. He was on his feet for hours, carrying patients, moving equipment, going for casual jogs. But that wasn't what Musashi meant. Musashi was talking about resilience, endurance, the ability to act with full clarity even when the body is screaming for relief. The night of the failure he had been exhausted. Not dangerously so, but enough that his reaction time was duller, his thinking slightly slower, his presence inconsistent. He had always told himself that fatigue was part of the job, but deep down he knew it had been a factor. He knew his body had been working against him. And now that he had reclaimed control of his mind, he couldn't ignore the truth. If he didn't build a stronger body, he would eventually break again. So he began the next phase of his training, not with weights, not with gym routines, not with some flashy physical transformation program. Instead, he chose something brutal in its simplicity. The hospital stairs, 10 flights, concrete, unforgiving. The kind of physical challenge no one glamorizes because it doesn't look impressive, but it builds the exact kind of strength Musashi spoke about, the kind that doesn't rely on adrenaline or motivation. The first morning, Adrian put on his scrubs, tightened his shoes, and resolved to climb the entire tower twice before his shift. He didn't blast music or hype himself up. He just began. And halfway up the second ascent, his legs started trembling, his breath strained, sweat stinging his eyes. The voice inside, the old one, returned with every excuse he had eliminated from the rest of his life. You have a long shift ahead. You don't need to do this. You're not an athlete. This is enough for today. But Musashi had warned him. The enemy adapts. The mind he had quieted through elimination was finding new terrain to resist him. And Adrian knew this was the moment that mattered. Not the climb, but the refusal to obey the voice. So he kept climbing. By the time he reached the top of the stairwell, his hands were shaking, his scrubs damp with sweat, and his lungs burning in a way that made him question his own sanity. He stood at the top of the stairwell, staring at the cold metal rail, breathing hard, trying to force the world back into focus. But beneath the exhaustion was something solid, a sense of grounding he hadn't felt in years. The next day, he did it again, and the day after that, and the day after that. Some mornings he moved quickly. Some mornings he dragged his body up each step like he was carrying a lifetime of weight, but he never missed a day. He allowed no negotiation. He adjusted the pace when needed,
but he never gave himself permission to stop. By day 20, he no longer felt the burn as punishment. He felt it as forging, as proof, as a declaration that he was building not just strength, but reliability, the kind that carries into crisis. By day 30, something profound shifted. He reached the top of the stairwell and didn't need to lean on the rail. His breath steadied faster. His legs held firm. But more importantly, his mind stayed silent. No excuses, no bargaining, no resistance. He realized then that this training had nothing to do with fitness. It was about building a body that never gives the mind a reason to hesitate again. Because the next crisis would come. A doctor's life guarantees it, and Adrian intended to meet that crisis with a body that would not fail him. He didn't know it yet, but his next test was approaching, one that would challenge not just his body and mind, but the part of himself he thought he had already conquered.
Chapter 5. HEIJŌ-SHIN, Awareness That Stays. After weeks of relentless stair climbs, early morning drills, and micro-practice in every corner of the hospital, Adrian began to notice a subtle shift. His body was stronger, yes, but that was almost secondary. The real change was in the spaces between his actions, in the calm that lingered after a task was done, in the clarity that stayed after a stressful encounter. He had begun practicing HEIJŌ-SHIN, the principle Musashi described as, "The battle does not end when the enemy falls." Awareness must remain, vigilance must persist, presence must continue even after action. Before, Adrian would solve a problem and immediately retreat. A patient stabilized? He'd step back, breathe a little, and let his mind drift elsewhere. A procedure finished? He'd check his phone, answer emails, scroll through messages. He thought that was self-care, small breaks, necessary for sanity. But Musashi's wisdom was relentless. True mastery required the lessons of each moment to sink in, to be absorbed, to shape the next action. Otherwise, the battle, the work, was never truly won. So Adrian started staying present. After finishing rounds, he would pause at each patient's bedside for a full 30 seconds, just observing. He wouldn't think about the next task. He wouldn't review charts or plan schedules. He would just be there, present with the moment. After complex procedures, he would sit quietly in the empty break room, replaying what had happened, noticing what worked, noticing what could have gone wrong, and most importantly, feeling nothing but clarity. No guilt, no anxiety, no rush to move on. The effect was almost imperceptible to others at first. His colleagues noticed he seemed more grounded, less reactive, but they didn't understand why. Adrian, however, felt it in the way he moved through chaos without tension, in the way he noticed patterns before they became problems, in the way he anticipated difficulties without fear or effort. He was no longer merely responding to events. He was absorbing them, integrating them, and allowing them to shape him without taking him hostage. It was during a particularly hectic night in the ER that HEIJŌ-SHIN revealed its full power. A multi-car accident had dumped 8 critical patients into the hospital within an hour. Monitors were beeping constantly. Families screamed. Nurses shouted instructions. Orders overlapped. The chaos could have drowned him. But Adrian didn't panic. He didn't freeze. His mind didn't race or spiral. Instead, he was fully there in every action, noticing the layout of the room, the movement of every staff member, the vitals of every patient. His awareness wasn't reactive. It was continuous, unbroken, present. When a young nurse fumbled a line, he caught it instinctively. When a monitor alarmed prematurely, he recalibrated it without hesitation. When family members shouted, he spoke once, clearly, and they obeyed without resistance. Others in the ER worked frantically, trying to keep up, while Adrian moved like the eye of a storm, calm, steady, untouchable. That night, a senior attending later told him, I've never seen anyone hold that room together like you did then. You were everywhere and nowhere, calm and total. That's rare." And Adrian understood in that moment that Zanshin wasn't about skill, it wasn't about knowledge, it wasn't about speed, it was about constancy, about the ability to stay rooted in presence, in awareness, long after the immediate crisis has passed. The mind that does not wander, the mind that absorbs lessons as they happen, the mind that stays awake when everyone else relaxes. It was exhausting at first. It demanded more than mere attention. It demanded a restructuring of his perception of time, of action, of responsibility. But each time he succeeded, each time he remained present when the room around him threatened to consume him, he felt the quiet growth of a new kind of strength, one that Musashi would have recognized immediately, a body and mind working as one, disciplined, unfaltering, unshaken. And Adrian knew that this was just the beginning. Zanshin was not a destination, it was a platform. What came next would test him further, challenging the depth of his stillness and the immovability of his mind.
Chapter 6. HEIJŌ-SHIN, the immovable mind. The real test came quietly, without warning, as life has a way of delivering it. It wasn't a controlled scenario. It wasn't a drill. It was a storm, sudden and unrelenting, striking in the form of a multi-trauma code, the kind of emergency that makes even seasoned staff hesitate, the kind that had haunted Adrian months earlier when he had failed to act with full clarity. A patient had been rushed in after a high-rise construction accident, severe trauma, multiple fractures, a bleeding artery that refused to clot. Alarms screamed, monitors blinked warnings, and the ER erupted into controlled chaos. Every second mattered. The young residents panicked, uncertain who should lead. The nurses moved frantically, shouting instructions over the beeping machines. And Adrian, standing at the center, felt the old reflex tickle at the edges of his consciousness, the urge to freeze, to step back, to let someone else take control. But the old Adrian was gone. In his place was something far more dangerous to internal doubt, a still, unshakable mind. HEIJŌ-SHIN, the immovable mind. Musashi had written that a warrior must be like a mountain, unyielding to wind, unshaken by storm. Adrian realized now what that truly meant. It wasn't about bravery. It wasn't about confidence. It was about presence. Absolute, unwavering presence that refused to be scattered by panic, fear, or expectation. He moved. Each step, each decision, each instruction was precise, deliberate, and calm. He didn't shout. He didn't overcompensate. He didn't second-guess. He was simply the eye of the storm in the center of it. "Clamp the artery," he said to one resident. "Give me 2 units stat. Start the transfusion while maintaining vitals. Monitor BP every 30 seconds. The staff obeyed, not out of fear, not because of authority, but because his calm rooted them. Minutes passed like hours. Sweat ran down Adrian's temples, but his mind never wavered. He observed, adapted, and acted. Every movement was deliberate, yet fluid. Every decision was weighted, measured, unshakable. And when the patient stabilized, pulse steady, bleeding controlled, vitals normal, Adrian barely exhaled. The chaos had not penetrated him. His mind had not fractured. His body had not faltered. The immovable mind had held. Later, as the team dispersed and the attending physician gave quiet praise, Adrian understood the depth of the transformation. HEIJŌ-SHIN was not a technique. It was not training or knowledge alone. It was a condition of being, a state where neither external chaos nor internal doubt could alter the course of action, where the mind, like a rooted tree, stood firm regardless of the storm. And in that moment, Adrian glimpsed the magnitude of what Musashi had been teaching centuries ago. Victory in life, or in the ER, was not about being faster, stronger, or smarter than the challenge. It was about remaining unbroken while everything around you tried to fracture you. It was about eliminating the sway of fear, hesitation, and distraction until action flowed purely from presence and purpose. The patient survived, yes, but Adrian had survived something far greater. He had survived himself, the version that doubted, panicked, and failed. And in that survival, he realized there was no going back. The immovable mind was no longer a lesson. It was a part of him. Even as the adrenaline faded, the calm remained. The lessons of elimination, the forging of the body, the practice of everyday mind, and now the immovable mind had coalesced. Musashi's path was no longer abstract philosophy. It was a living, breathing reality in Adrian's hands, his body, and his mind. And as he left the ER that night, walking through the quiet halls, he knew the next principle awaited. One more cut, one more transformation, more subtle, more difficult to grasp. The strategy of void. Chapter 7. HEIJŌ, the strategy of the void. Musashi said, "Do not seek victory, seek to avoid defeat." Adrian understood this principle differently now. It wasn't about outperforming his colleagues or showing off skill. It was about eliminating openings, the small mistakes, the half-decisions, the moments when distraction or ego could sneak in. At work, he stopped trying to impress. He stopped racing to prove himself. Instead, he focused on consistency, precise procedures, clear communication, no shortcuts, no wasted movement. His actions became invisible in their perfection. No drama, no panic, just results. Others noticed the difference. Where some burned out in effort, Adrian thrived in steadiness. The strategy of void, he realized, was not flashy. It was invisible power, the kind that leaves no weak points for life to exploit. Chapter 8. Sutemi, letting go of the self. Even with body, mind, and awareness trained, one fear lingered, the fear of failing again. Adrian realized it wasn't about skill, it was about attachment to outcomes, recognition, success. Musashi's Sutemi demanded a radical surrender. Stop identifying with wins or losses. Stop clinging to validation. Adrian stopped tracking accomplishments. He stopped counting training days. He stopped seeking praise. He practiced medicine, trained, and stayed present not to prove anything, but because it was who he had become. And as he did, people noticed a subtle shift. His presence unsettled others. Not because he was arrogant, but because he reflected what they avoided: discipline without drama, mastery without attachment, strength without display. And a year after starting this path, Adrian was unrecognizable. Not in personality, not in demeanor, but in essence. He didn't act disciplined, he was disciplined. Training wasn't something he did, it was who he was. His body, mind, and awareness worked in seamless unity. Fear, hesitation, doubt, they were gone because there was no part of him left for them to attach to. Musashi's teachings had been brutal, but exact. The patient survived, yes, but Adrian had survived himself, and that mattered far more. He had become a living demonstration of Musashi's principles: elimination, everyday mind, immovable mind, strategy of void, letting go of self. Strength that scares others isn't flashy or loud, it's quiet, unshakable, absolute. And the truth was clear. The difference between Adrian and everyone else wasn't talent, it wasn't circumstance, it was willingness. The willingness to cut away what makes you weak, to endure, to practice until action becomes identity. Now take a moment and imagine your own life for a second. Think about the tasks you avoid, the fears that hold you back, the habits that chip away at your focus every single day. Adrian's story isn't extraordinary because he was a doctor. It's extraordinary because he chose to apply Musashi's principles. And the same principles are available to you. You can start small. You can practice elimination by removing distractions in the morning, by committing to one micro action every day that builds discipline, by facing a fear instead of avoiding it. You can practice your mind to remain steady in stressful moments, like Adrian did in the ER. You can forge your body in ways that prepare you for life's chaos, even in tiny steps. And above all, you can let go of attachment to outcomes. Stop worrying about perfection, recognition, or approval, and focus on becoming the kind of person that can't be shaken. These aren't abstract lessons. These are tools for everyday life. In meetings, in school, in relationships, in the little moments where most people hesitate, you can apply Musashi's methods. You can cultivate awareness, presence, and resilience that will quietly change everything around you. So ask yourself this: what is the first weakness you will eliminate today, and how will you begin to train yourself to become unshakable?